Hey everybody, in this video we're kicking off a new series on Facebook ad targeting. I've watched a lot of people do targeting and I feel like most people are actually overcomplicating it by quite a bit. So what we're going to do here in this series is essentially go through each type of targeting that you can do and show you how and when to use it. Alright, so in this video specifically we're going to focus on demographic targeting. So before we jump into how you can use it, or why you can use it rather, I'm going to show you how it works and sort of what your various options are. So what you would consider demographics, first of all you have this section here with location, age, gender, and language. And this is pretty straightforward obviously. So you can put in more specific locations, you can put together strings of different countries, you can check people living here now, people who are recently here, people traveling, so on and so forth. Age range, gender, language, it's all pretty self-explanatory. Something, it actually embarrassingly took me a little while to realize when I first started doing Facebook ads is that you have this browse option over here, and this will actually show you a list of things that you can use. So you have this demographic drop down, and inside of here you have education, finances, life events, things about parents, relationships, and then work. So I'm of the perspective that a lot of people do exactly what I did when I first started doing Facebook ads when they come in here and they start layering up all kinds of different targeting options and creating these sort of kind of bizarrely stacked targets to what they think is going to end up being their ideal customer. And I think that really the vast majority of the time that's just too complicated. So let's take a quick look at some situations where you might want to use demographic targeting and how it makes sense to do that. So first of all, I want you to consider local businesses. So let's say that we are looking at Sarasota, Florida. Okay. So you can see here, when we narrow this down, first of all, for a local business, you might want to trim this down. It depends on the type of business. People will travel different distances for different sorts of businesses. So for example, I think it's a gym. There's a lot of gyms around, so people aren't going to go as far. Maybe people go a little bit farther for their favorite hairstylist, or maybe even a little bit farther for like a lawyer. I don't know the exact ranges on those, but in general, I would bring this down to probably 10 miles just for, or that ballpark. I mean, maybe a little bit more. Depends again on what you're selling. But you can see here, so we lower this down to 10 miles. We have 370,000 people. That's not a huge audience by itself. So let's suppose that we're doing, we're a hairstylist or a hair salon or something. And we might know that our ideal customer is women, so we would just switch over to women. Being in Sarasota, in the Gulf Coast of Florida, probably a lot of our clients are a little bit older, so we could bump this age up if we wanted to. Maybe make it like 28. So you can see here we have 170,000 people. So we could push this further. And again, so this audience size thing is something that people talk about. I remember in the very early days when I first started doing Facebook ads, I was like everybody else and I was trying to learn how to do drop shipping, and people would quote all of these magic numbers like, oh, you have to have 620,000 people in your targeting or whatever. And most of that is just nonsense. I think it really depends on what you're selling, and you want to have something that's not too narrow where you exhaust the audience immediately, because honestly you don't know to extreme precision most of the time who your ideal customer is. So if we have women in this area between 28 and 65 plus, that might be good enough as it is. We might want to drill down a little bit more, but we wouldn't want to start seeing like 10 or 20,000 people up here probably. If you get to that and you want to test it, it's fine, but I like to have a little bit more room. So, and that gets into kind of some strategy conversation. So what you would typically do here, and I guess I can just throw this in at this point. So what you would typically want to do is target these 170,000 people with something that gauges their interest, where you get cheap video views or cheap clicks of some kind, and then retarget the people who engaged. And so you're really doing kind of a canvas strategy and then retarget the people who are interested. And I think that fits most use cases in terms of small business. But if we wanted to get more specific here, so obviously we've been changing the age up. We can also layer other demographics on. So let's just say that we wanted to do something like um, the top 5% of zip codes. So if we click that, well, we have 170,000, which tells you something about living in Sarasota. Um, we could do, let's see, really that might be, I think that might be about it for a hairstylist here. I mean, we don't want to get too narrow, as I said. So, that kind of shows you what you can do. And we talked a little bit about the strategy. I mean, really, for demographics here, I mean, I just wouldn't want to layer too much more because, you're going to end up with, well, let's just see what we can play around here with. Like, what you could do is, put on something related to relationships or birthdays or anniversaries or something like that. Um, Anniversary within 30 days. Surely they don't mean to tell me that everybody, oh, okay, I have this detailed targeting expansion. Let's turn that off. Okay, that may make a little more sense. Okay, so anniversary within 30 days, that's fewer than 1,000 people. You could layer up a bunch of stuff related to special events happening. Let's check our top 5% again without that targeting on there and see what that does. Okay, so now we have 33,000 people. So suppose you're running a very high-end hair salon. That actually makes more sense. So now we've just got these 33,000, and that might be an interesting thing to try, right? Like if you're kind of a top-end salon or some other kind of expensive local business, you want to target the people who come from the highest end zip codes. There you go. So I think that kind of explains what all you can do with local businesses. I mean, it really depends on what you're selling about whether or not the life events make any sense to target. But again, you can kind of dig through these, but you have to think about what's your specific business case. And you'd have to test, because really 33,000 and 170,000 people is not a huge amount of range. I mean, realistically, like I'm running ads that target millions of people. And Facebook's pretty good now at figuring out who's interested. So if if you're running some kind of campaign where you want to engage with high-end customers, it might be worth running this experiment with this layered and then also run beside it an ad set that's targeting all 170,000 and see which one does better. Okay, so that's local businesses. Let's reset all of this back to where it was. And we just want to get rid of Sarasota and maybe put United States back. Okay. Yeah, so now we have 230 million people, so we're reset. Okay, so the next way that you can use demographic targeting is for targeting people or targeting products that have sort of demographic drivers, maybe you would call it. So for example, most products on the market have better targeting options, but there's some things that are really specifically motivated by the demographics. So for example, think about male hair loss. So that impacts a specific age range of men, and it's a very high percentage of all men. So, there may be other ways to target that. I haven't sold a hair loss product on Facebook before, so I haven't really dug through this exercise entirely. But a reasonable test would be probably to say, target men aged 30 to 40, and just canvas and see what kind of interest you get. You might want to layer on potentially some of the financial data, because you might hypothesize that actually The men who are going to take action on this are people who are, at a certain point in their career, or, they have a certain income status or something like that. All right, so let's run through an example of that and just kind of see. So we can actually pretty easily try that. So we can just see how many people are in this. If we said 30 to 40 men, how many of those guys are there? There's 28 million. So that's a pretty big audience. And I mean, the deal is, if you're selling a hair loss product, you're going to want to be able to scale to a lot of people. So maybe that's fine. You probably know more, or you would want to know more about your audience. So, if you're just starting brand new, you might want to run ads to this group and then let Facebook tell you, who's engaging. So your ad cost might be higher initially because you're just hitting everybody. And then once you see who buys or whatever, you retarget people. Well, actually, what you would end up doing probably is a lookalike audience after that, but still you would learn something about the demographics if you want to do further demographic or interest targeting. But you could also say, like we said, maybe, well, let's explore this work thing a little bit. Well, I don't want to. They took away a bunch of options a little while back. So we could do education level, college grad. That gets us down to 9 million, so that's going to slice this quite a bit. We could also layer, so we narrow the audience, and do demographics again, and do, top 10%, 900,000. So if we include the 5%, is that more people? No, it's the same. Okay, and then you could do like. So you could cut this down quite a bit. So you're saying just show us college grads, men who are in these higher end zip codes, and you could guess that used to you could do a lot more. I think a couple of years ago on this targeting, but now you kind of have this slightly more broad thing going on. But still, I mean, so this would be something you would want to test. Is what works better, to go really broad with the 28 million, or to drill down to a smaller number that's potentially people who might be closer to what you expect to be buyers. So that's one interesting way to use demographics. Again, I think the term demographic driver is probably a good one for how to decide whether to do demographic targeting purely for your first batch of ads. You know, there's a number of things that fall into this category. Like, for example, I saw recently people running ads for male fertility kits, basically, and I think what they're probably doing. I mean, I don't know. I didn't study it, but it would be reasonable at least to do a test where you say target people who live in these, like men in their 30s who live in big cities, or these top zip codes or whatever. And you could do that because you would say, well, at that age, a lot of people who live in big cities, they're getting married and having kids later. So this might be something they're concerned about. So it is sort of this, it's a demographic concern again. What I've seen people do before, so let's do one more little demo here. Let's clear all of this, put it back to what it was. What I have seen people do, and I think this is kind of what you don't want to do. What I've seen people do is, for example, let's say that you want to sell like expensive watches or something like that. So let's say that you are, I don't know, you're running Panerai or some other expensive watch brand, luxury watch brand. So some people, I think, sometimes would say, well, let's target those top zip codes. And I don't think that, that might work to some extent, but you have such better options. So like, if like, let's say you're Panerai, you could just target people who like Rolex. Now that actually is probably not great, because I think Rolex appeals to a certain group of people and Panerai appeals to a different group of people. But you could target people who have interests that sort of surround the brand of Panerai. You could target people who are interested in other high-end watch brands, and you could run experiments to see which ones of those convert better. Again, realistically, for an established company with customers, you're probably running lookalikes most of the time, and retargeting most of the time, so you're probably not even doing this. But let's say you're launching a similar type of thing and you don't have any customers yet. You would want to do something more like that. You wouldn't want to do demographics, just because you can get more specific in terms of the brand sentiment when you hit on interests. So one caveat to all of this, which I would add, is if you're working with clients, the first thing you're always going to want to do is to get them to detail their ideal customer profile to you, so that you can get them essentially to tell you, who buys from them typically already. And then you would want to, if you have ideas for these sorts of experiments, you would propose those, with the idea that you're helping them find a new customer base. But you would certainly want to take into consideration their current ideal customer profile. You wouldn't want to just start running these sorts of targeting experiments without taking that into consideration, and then running those ads as a baseline, or looking at the existing ads that they already have as a baseline, so that you can know if these ideas actually are helpful. So that being said, we've talked about local ads can be useful for just demographics, as in the canvassing strategy and then retargeting. And we've talked about ads for products that have sort of this demographic driver, as I called it, where the demographics really dictate who is going to want the product. The third way, and the last way we'll talk about that you can use demographics, is really just layering onto other sorts of things. So, like if we considered our last example, where let's say you're launching a luxury watch brand, and let's say that it is something where Rolex would be something that the people are interested in. So maybe it has that kind of Submariner look or something like that. So you could target people who like Rolex. We could actually do people who like the Rolex Submariner. That's kind of already a decent audience size as it is. So for the purposes of this experiment or demo, let's just go with Rolex, which gets 10 million people. What you might do is narrow and say, okay, now let's do the demographic thing, and let's do the top 5% of zip codes or something. So what does that get me? 570,000 people. So, what I would do actually, and check out our video on audience overlap. So if I'm taking on a project like this, what I'm going to start by doing is actually say, okay, let me brainstorm all of these possible audiences, and then let me create saved audiences, and then go check the overlap. Because what you might find out, like if you're starting a company and you're selling like a competitor to the Rolex Submariner, which is a very specific style of watch if you're not familiar. And Rolex has a bunch of styles. So, if you're doing a Submariner competitor, people who buy a Datejust are going to probably not be as interested in your brand. So, and sorry for the watch geekery, but, it is what it is. So, what you would probably do is create this audience here, which is 570,000 people, and then create the audience for the Submariner, which I think was maybe like 900,000 people, and then check the overlap. If there's a really big overlap, maybe you test something like we do in the audience overlap thing. If there's no overlap or very little overlap, and that your product is going to appeal to the Submariner type people, I don't know, you could test. I'm always up for testing. So you could just run both of them side by side and see which one does better. But anyway, so that's kind of, layering, essentially. Just take an interest that's big enough where you have 10 million people, and then say, let's whittle that down a little bit more. So I think that's it for demographics. If you have any questions, just throw a comment in the YouTube, and I will get back to you on there. I think in the next video, we're probably going to go over interests. I'm going to kind of, make a list of all the different things here that we could cover. But yeah, I think we'll do that. We'll probably do one on the behaviors thing section. We'll do a lookalike targeting video, and yeah. So if you're interested in this, click subscribe and hit the bell icon so you can stay in touch with what we're doing here. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you in the next one.